got straight up 5 o'clock, so we're going to go ahead and get started. And if anybody comes in late, we'll let them kind of scoot on in. I just wanted to introduce this checkpoint meeting. I know that a lot of times we make a resolution to read through the Bible, and it seems like we get lost when the Israelites get lost. And it's hard for us to get through the desert, through the wilderness. And so I just want to encourage you, this is really an exciting period in redemptive history where God is calling out a nation for himself, and he is fulfilling his promise to redeem all mankind. He is choosing to do that through the nation of Israel. And I just wanted to encourage you as we go through Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, that the Old Testament saints, they really treasured this portion of Scripture. And for them, this is all the Scripture that they had. This is their Bible. The Pentateuch, what we're going to be talking about tonight, like I said, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, that was their Bible. And this is what David said. He said, "Oh, how I love your law. It is my meditation all the day." And so, David, he dwelt on the law all the time. It was his responsibility as king to read the law and to understand it. And he loved it. And so, in this revelation, this law was enough for the people of Israel. Elsewhere in Psalm 19:7, he wrote, "The law of the Lord is perfect, reviving the soul. The testimony of the Lord is sure, making wise the simple." And when he wrote, "The law of the Lord is perfect," he means that it's complete. There's nothing else that he needed right now or right then as he lived to live according to the covenant that God had made with his people Israel. And so, but you may be thinking, well, that's good for David, but what about for me? That's good for the Old Testament saints, but what about for me? I'm New Testament. I'm going to read what Paul wrote to the Corinthian church, and I just want to remind you that the Corinthian church was made up of mostly Gentile believers. And so this is what he wrote in 1 Corinthians 10:6-11. "Now these things took place as examples for us, that we might not desire evil as they did. Do not be idolaters, as some of them were, as it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. We must not indulge in sexual immorality, as some of them did, and 23,000 fell in a single day. We must not put Christ to the test, as some of them did and were destroyed by serpents, nor grumble, as some of them did and were destroyed by the destroyer. Now these things happened to them as an example, but they were written down for our instruction, on whom the end of the ages has come." And so I just want to encourage you to approach this next section of Scripture with excitement, with anticipation, because even though it was written to the Israelites, it was written for us. So I'd just like to pray real quick, and then Bryan can come. Lord God, we just are so overwhelmed that you would choose us from before the beginning of time, that we might be part of the church, that we might be redeemed, that we can reflect your glory. And Lord, I thank you for this section of Scripture where we can learn more about your character, who you are, and what you have done for us. And Lord, you have done amazing things for us to redeem us to yourself. Lord, I pray that our hearts would be attentive to your word. Help us, Lord, to understand the background, and so we might be able to get the most out of your word. We pray these things in Christ's name. Amen.
All right. I kind of smile because I got to get Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. 2 years ago, we started Exodus in Sunday school. We're at Numbers 15. So this is like 4 years worth of stuff I've got to try to get into a 40-minute presentation. It's not going to be easy. So recognizing that, I would love to have question and answer time at the end, but that is not going to happen. So if you have questions, best thing to do is just email me those questions or whatever. So tonight we're going to be looking at, briefly, very briefly, 4 books of the Bible. I've got 10 minutes for each one of the books. So we're going to be flying through those. How many is the first time? How many didn't do this last year? This is your first time? Wow, cool. If you did this last year, this will be nothing like last year's, all right? I prepared everything new, everything fresh, so you're not getting the same stuff you got last year. So it's like, well, I went last year, so I'm not going to come to them this year. If you know anybody that's doing that, they're all brand new. This is all new stuff, not rehashed. So, I mean, it's not new stuff, but I'm not just taking my notes from last year and doing them. I'm restudying everything and re-preparing.
Is this still good?
I've got gum. It'll be better, actually. So I can't talk with gum in my mouth. All right, so Exodus. Really, Exodus, as we finish Genesis in about 1805 BC. So about 2,000 years before Christ is when Genesis ends. Genesis ends with Jacob and his sons and their families going down into Egypt. There are 70 total. When they get into Egypt, there are 70 people that go down to Egypt. There's actually 66 plus Joseph's 4. So that's 70 people total in Egypt. By the time we get to the start of Exodus, there are now 2 million. 2 million people. It's 1805 when Jacob and Joseph and them go down into Egypt. It is about 1525 BC when Exodus begins with the birth of Moses. At the birth of Moses was born in about 1525 BC. So a lot has happened, a lot has passed. In that 400 years, or almost 400 years, a lot has happened to Israel. They've gone down into Egypt. And remember, that Egypt is not their promised land. Egypt is not the place they were supposed to stay. Egypt is not the land that God promised. And if you've ever heard me talk at all, you know that the promise of God to Abraham was a land promise, not just a people promise. It was a land promise. He promised Abraham a specific piece of land. And that's very important. Because as they go down into Egypt, Abraham left the promised land twice. If you remember, he left because of famine twice. He left once and went to Egypt, and he went back. He left another time and went to Abimelech, and he came back. Isaac left the promised land once. He went to Abimelech, and he came back. Jacob leaves once and never goes back for 400 years. So the people, rather than leaving Egypt and going back to the promised land, they just stay there. And while they're there, there's actually a prophecy that God makes to Jacob at the end of Genesis. It says where Jacob stops, he recognizes he's going down into Egypt, and he's afraid of dying, afraid of getting out of God's will, and so he stops, and he basically seeks God. You should have read this already, or you should be reading this soon. He asks God, basically, should I go down? And God says, yes, go down. And when you get down there, you're going to be there for 400 years before I bring you out. So God prophesied this. In that 400 years, some really good things have happened to Israel. They've prospered. They've grown. They've become a great nation. They've grown from about 70 to about 2 million. They've undergone some persecution. Now, that's a bad thing that's happened because the Pharaoh has now become afraid of them. If you understand world history, you understand at the same time that that this all starts to take place, you understand there are some things going on in Egyptian history as well with a new Pharaoh, a new group of people taking over that are very concerned about their right to rule or their ability to stay in leadership and to stay in rule. And so that Pharaoh now becomes very afraid of this large group of people called the Jews who are living in a place called Goshen, and so he begins to oppress them. With the finality, they become slaves. But in the middle of all that, no matter how hard Pharaoh tries to oppress them, no matter how much he tries to make life hard for him, the people of Israel, because of the blessing of God, continue to prosper, continue to grow, and continue to get stronger. But the people of Israel, also in that 400 years, largely forget God. They forget who he is. Before they go down, and I think it's important to get this, before they go down into Egypt, there is no such thing as the law yet. There's no such thing as the law. In fact, there's not really any kind of covenant with Israel except for the Abrahamic covenant, which is, I will bless you, I will make you a great nation, and in you all nations will be blessed. That's Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 3, Genesis 15 again, and Genesis 22. So those are where that promise is found. But as far as the law and sacrifice and temple, none of that exists yet. None of that exists yet. And because of the situation that Israel finds herself in the land of Egypt, Israel largely forgets God, and Israel becomes accustomed to life in Egypt. So that's going to be a significant issue. But Israel also, again, there's oppression. There's oppression in Egypt, and the people of Israel begin to call out to God. They begin to call out to God, and God says in Exodus chapter 3, He's heard their cry and He's going to deliver them from Egypt. So Genesis ends 1805 BC. Moses is born in about 1525 BC. Moses flees to Midian in about 1485 BC, and the Exodus happens in about 1445 BC. So that kind of gives you a rough, and you may want this in written form. My written form is this right now. You can have, I'll maybe try to print something up, but I don't have anything to print it up yet, so just take notes really fast. You'll be fine. Some key stories that you'll recognize as you read through the book of Exodus. Moses and the bulrushes, you'll hear that story. Moses gets put in the little boat, little ark, and Esther, that's not her name. The Pharaoh's daughter finds him. The burning bush is a story found in Exodus chapter 3. The 10 plagues are found in Exodus. Passover starts in Exodus. The golden calf story is found in Exodus. The 10 commandments are found in Exodus. Those are the stories that you'll remember as you read through the book of Exodus. Key themes in Exodus are Yahweh or Jehovah. Until we get to Exodus, God really has not revealed Himself or called Himself to the people Yahweh yet. It's when in Exodus chapter 3, Moses, I got the name right. Moses is out tending sheep for his father-in-law Jethro, right? He's out tending sheep for his father-in-law Jethro, and he looks off to the side and he sees a bush that is burning on top of a mountain. The bush is burning, but it's not being consumed. So he goes up to find out what's going on. He goes up to find what's going on, and he hears a voice saying, "Take off your shoes, you're standing on holy ground." And so Moses takes off his shoes, he's standing on holy ground, and he approaches, and God speaks to him at that point and says, I've heard my people, I've heard the oppression of my people, and I'm going to respond to that. And so he says to Moses, I'm going to send you. And Moses then begins to offer a series of objections. Moses has tried to deliver the people once already, and it failed. You'll see that when you read. I'm not going to give you every story. You'll see that when you read. But when Moses is 40 years old, he tries to deliver the people, but he fails. So he goes away, figuring he's done. I think Moses thinks, I'm finished. I'll just be a shepherd. This is a great life. It's a good life. I like my life here. So he goes and God says, I'm going to send you to deliver my people. And Moses says, there's a problem with that, God. First problem is, okay, when I go there, they're going to ask, who is it that sent you? And God introduces himself at that point, Yahweh. And the name Yahweh, YHWH, sometimes we're called Jehovah, in your Bible, whenever you see God calling himself capital L, capital O, capital R, capital D, Lord, all in caps, that is the name Yahweh that is used there. And that is a very specific name, and it's a name that he uses only in conjunction with his covenant people, Israel. They're very special people to him, the covenant people of Israel. And it has to do with his covenant-keeping ability and who he is. So really, as we walk through the book of Exodus, you'll get a picture of who God is and his love for his people and his desire for them. And really how his name is attached to his people. In fact, at one point in the book of Exodus, God is going to tell Moses, I'll let you get there, but at one point, for some reason, God is going to tell Moses, step aside, I'm going to destroy these people and start over with you. And Moses says, no, you can't do that. You can't do that because of your name. Your name is so attached to this people, you can't destroy this people. So I'll let you figure out when that is, but look at about Exodus 34. That's where you'll find that happening. I'm not going to tell you where it is, what it is. You just have to find it. So there's really a close connection between God, his name, and his people. And that's one of the themes that you'll find throughout the book of Exodus. Another key theme in the book of Exodus is that of redemption. That of redemption. Of God buying his people back. Of God taking his people out of Egypt and beginning to take them to the land. One of the key forms of redemption in the first part of the book, in the 10 plagues, is the redemption of the Passover lamb. Now, the Passover lamb provides redemption for the firstborn of the people. We're also going to see how the Levites provide redemption for the firstborn of the people. God is going to trade the firstborn in Egypt, or Israel, for the Levites. He's going to make a trade with them for the Levites. Redemption is a key theme throughout the book of Exodus as well. The law. The law is absolutely one of the key themes. The law is introduced here in the book of Exodus. Exodus chapter 20 is the law is introduced and given to the people. Not like Charlton Heston did it. It's different than that. It's given to the people when they all get to Mount Sinai. They're all at the foot of Sinai. God appears and it is heard by all the people, giving them the 10 commandments. They all hear the 10 commandments. Then Moses goes up the mountain, not before. All right, and you do the math. Moses goes up and down about 5 times, up and down Mount Sinai. But the law is given. The law is a huge part of the book of Exodus, and it's really where the law is introduced. The law, just so we get it, the law is the Old Testament law between God and his people Israel. It's really, really limited. The Old Testament law, the law of Moses, is the law between God and his people Israel. So while we get in Genesis, we get all of mankind kind of the focus, with it narrowing down to Abraham and to Isaac and to Jacob and his sons. By the time we hit Exodus, there's really one people in focus, and the one people in focus is the people of Israel. That law is intended for Israel, meant for Israel, and only for Israel. I think that's significant because that means who in here is part of Israel? None of us are. None of us are. You got a question about that? Email me. I'm just hoping to pique your interest a little bit. So the law is a big deal. And tabernacle. Tabernacle is another big key theme in the book of Exodus. Tabernacle really is the dwelling place, or God with us, if you will. It's God's dwelling place with man. That's what tabernacle means. Tabernacle doesn't mean temple. It doesn't mean special, ornate thing. It doesn't even mean, it means dwelling place. That's what tabernacle means. And when God says to his people, you will be my people and I will be God, I will dwell with you, what he's saying is, I've been apart from you, but I'm going to dwell with you. I'm going to dwell with you in the tabernacle. It was through a pillar of fire and a pillar of cloud. That's what the tabernacle, how God dwelt with his people. He led them through the wilderness with a pillar of cloud and pillar of fire, but he dwelt with them at the tabernacle, on the mercy seat, or above the mercy seat in the tabernacle as a pillar of cloud and a pillar of fire. So tabernacle is a huge idea, a huge thing, and that really is the concept of God not apart from his people, but God with his people. That's the important part of tabernacle. So those are kind of the dates, if you will, key players. The key players in, or key figures in the book of Exodus are, of course, God himself. Let's not forget him. He's the big deal. Moses, Aaron, and Miriam, and then Israel. So those would be, and if you want to give Pharaoh some cred, which we shouldn't, he just stood against God. Pharaoh's a major player as well, but he major plays against God. He's the antagonist, if you will, against Moses' protagonism. So those are the key players. An outline, a real quick outline. I've condensed each one of these books into an outline. Each point has just one word for you, so hopefully we can get that outline. Number 1, oppression, chapters 1 through 11. Number 2, deliverance, chapters 12 through 14. Number 3, education, chapters 15 through 18. 4, consecration, chapters 19 through 34. And then worship, chapters 35 through 40. That's kind of how the book of Exodus divides itself if you're walking through it. So that's Exodus. Whew. All right, it took me 15 minutes. I had 10. And again, I would love to share so much more. There's so much more I'd love to share, but I'm trying to get through 4 books, and it's not going to happen. Leviticus, we'll probably move faster through this one. I promise you, if you're going to bog down in your reading early on, it's going to be when you hit Leviticus. In fact, I think that one of the resets is to skip Leviticus and just catch up. I would encourage you, like I always encourage, don't skip Leviticus. Just push through. Push through. There's important stuff in Leviticus, or God wouldn't have it in here for us. It's really important to go ahead and read the book. So don't stop reading Leviticus. Exodus, I didn't tell you. The name Exodus means departure, and it really is the departure of Israel from Egypt. Leviticus means of the Levites, or pertaining to Levites. And it really is the God's giving of the Levitical law and how that works, and how now he's in Exodus chapter 20, he gave the bones, if you will, the skeleton of the law. In Leviticus, he actually puts flesh on that law. He actually puts muscle and flesh and builds the law. So this is how it really looks. Don't take the name of the Lord God in vain. But what does that look like? He tells us that in Leviticus. Don't kill your brother. He actually explains all the different ways to kill your brother in Leviticus, and not to do that. Actually, it's not like, hey, I know, where can you hide a body? That kind of. That's not what he's doing. But that's Leviticus actually explains and puts, while the skeleton of the law is built in Exodus, the meat of the law is found in Leviticus. So you don't want to miss Leviticus. Leviticus happens during the year that the people of Israel are at Sinai. I probably should have said that. As they come out of the land, Israel comes out of the land, they leave Egypt, they cross the Red Sea, they head down to Mount Sinai. It takes them 3 weeks to get there. It takes them 3 weeks to get to Sinai. From Exodus chapter 19 all the way to the beginning of Numbers is only that little bit over a year that they were at Sinai. That's all right there. God's doing all that stuff right there for them at Sinai. So that's how long it takes. So from Exodus 19 to Numbers chapter 11, really, Exodus 19 to Numbers 11, you have just a little bit over a year of time that takes place there. So that's what's going on. Leviticus takes place at the foot of Sinai as they're waiting, getting everything made, getting everything built. God's doing all the education for them, getting them really developed into a nation, and into what they need to do, where they're headed for. That's what they're doing that year. So what are some themes in the book of Leviticus? Themes of the book of Leviticus are holiness. Holiness is a key theme when we look at the book of Leviticus. He calls his people to holiness. I think it's important to understand what holiness means. Holiness does not mean piety. Holiness does not mean untouched with sin. That's not what holiness is. Holiness does not mean super special. Holiness means set apart for a purpose. Set apart for a purpose. The children of Israel were people who were set apart from Egypt, from the old ways, to serve the living and true God. When Paul talks in Galatians, he talks about how you were separated from idols to serve the living and true God. What he's explaining, what he's describing is holiness. And so the people of Israel are called to holiness. They're called to be separate from the rest of the world. And the way God is going to work in them, what God is going to do with them, the way God calls them to worship him is completely different than anything they'd ever known before. Anything they'd ever known before. What they had known was the system of worship in Egypt, where it was a worship where you worshiped foreign or gods that were represented by frogs and flies and gnats and cows. That's how gods were represented there. But God is calling them to worship him without a representation. Worship them without an image. Worship him without an image. And so they're called to a different kind of life, a different kind of response, and a different kind of worship than they'd ever known before. He calls them to be holy. He wants them to be holy. So holiness is a huge, in fact, one way you might read the book of Exodus to get yourself, rather than falling asleep as you're reading Exodus, which I get it, it's probably one of the most dry things you would have read so far, but just underline some of these things. When you come to the word holy, underline holy. And just look at how many times God calls his people to holiness. It's really significant. Because if he called them to holiness, Jesus repeats that command for New Testament believers when he says in Peter, be holy as I am holy. So it's the same kind of call for us. We're called to live different than the world around us. We're called to be holy as well, and you can see that as you're reading through the book of Leviticus. Another theme is ritual cleanliness. Well, isn't that the same thing as holiness? Absolutely not. Ritual cleanliness is not the same thing as holiness. Holiness is being set apart. Ritual cleanliness is being right before God ritually, so you can participate in worship. The Jews had a large system of worship that they were supposed to participate in, and then any kind of ceremonial or ritual uncleanness would prohibit them from partaking in that kind of worship. So he talks about, in Leviticus, he talks about what makes you unclean. And he talks about then how you get clean again. He talks about, so cleanliness, ritual cleanliness is a huge part of the book of Leviticus. Sacrifice. The book of Leviticus starts with a list of 5 offerings: the burnt offering, the grain offering, the sin offering, the fellowship offering. Those offerings start and are listed. The first 5 chapters of Leviticus are all just about offerings, but he walks them through sacrifice and what does sacrifice look like. And it's interesting as he walks them through sacrifice, and as he's making the list of acceptable sacrifices. You know, when you were probably in Sunday school, and you heard the story of Cain and Abel, right? It was probably taught to you like this: Abel brought an animal, and God accepted his animal because it was an animal. Cain brought vegetables, and God doesn't like vegetables. That's not what they heard of, but God didn't accept the vegetable because it was a vegetable. That's absolutely not true. In fact, God makes provision for, if you can't afford an animal, you can bring vegetables, and it counts. Don't trust me. Find it in the Bible. Find it in the Bible. It says it. It says if you're too poor to even bring a bird, you can bring fine grain and offer grain as a sacrifice. The same kind of sacrifice for a burnt offering, for a sin offering, for a fellowship offering. Now there also are other offerings that are called grain offerings, where you did bring vegetables. So God likes vegetables. So, you know, parents, don't ever let your kids say, well, if God doesn't like vegetables, neither do I. God does like vegetables. It has nothing to do, Cain's rejection of his sacrifice had nothing to do with the fact it was vegetables. It had everything to do with the fact that Cain's heart wasn't in it. So but you should have gotten that when you got through Genesis. Okay, so sacrifice is important. It's another key thing. I'm falling behind. Atonement. Atonement is a key thing. In fact, Leviticus 16 is the Day of Atonement. It walks through Israel what the Day of Atonement was. It's important to understand that atonement means covering. It means covering. It does not mean taking away. It does not mean removal of. So when a bull or a ram or a goat or a sheep or a handful of grain was offered as sacrifice, it did not take sin away. It merely covered sin. And most of the time it covered sin just for a period of time. Even the Day of Atonement only lasted for a year. And then it had to be offered again. And then it had to be offered again. Then it had to be offered again. For thousands of years, Israel had to offer the Day of Atonement sacrifice. Aaron, or the high priest, went into the Holy of Holies 4 times on the Day of Atonement. Once for himself with the bull, once for the people with the bull. Once for himself with the ram, once for the people with the ram. 4 times he had to go in every year on the Day of Atonement. And the author of Hebrews tells us that really accomplished nothing. That really accomplished nothing because atonement doesn't cut it. Atonement doesn't cut it. Propitiation covers it. Propitiation covers it. And Jesus, God says, was the propitiation for our sin. Jesus' sacrifice, Jesus' offering removes. But what it does tell us is how the sins of people were forborne by God through the covering of atonement made through the offering of the blood of bulls and rams, and occasionally through the offering of a handful of grain. So atonement's a big deal. And then another big section or big idea is the actual priesthood. What the priesthood looked like, what the priests were supposed to do, who were the priests, who weren't the priests, what the other Levites did. You see, only descendants of Aaron who who were descendants of Aaron were priests, but so they were the Aaronic priests, but there were other people called Levites, and all the Levites were involved in worship somehow. The book of Leviticus talks through and breaks down how they were part of that worship. So that's the book of Leviticus in a nutshell, in a little bitty nutshell. I promise you, there's more than that. An outline for Leviticus. Number 1 is sacrifices, chapters 1 through 7. Number 2 is ordination, really ordination of the priests, chapters 8 through 10. Number 3 is purity. What does ritual purity look like? And how is it attained? And how is it achieved? And how is it kept? How is it gotten back? That's chapters 11 through 16. And then holiness is the theme of verses chapters 17 through 27. So that's the book of Leviticus. All right, I'm taking 15 minutes each, but I'm going to try to do better. Numbers. What a fun book. If we were to call it, we'd call it phone book. That's what it feels like. Numbers it's called Numbers because in the book there are 2 separate censuses or censi, I guess. I don't know how you say that. It's a Latin word, I think, census, so it'd be censi. There are 2 censi in the book of Numbers. Numbers begins again while they're at Sinai. Numbers begins at just a year and 2 months after they've left Egypt. It feels like a lot longer than that. Feels like a lot longer than that because, Genesis we read 50 chapters of Genesis and we get through nearly 3,000 years of history, or 4,000 years of history. We get to Exodus and we get a year. It's like, come on. And then you get through Leviticus, we get maybe a few days, and now we get to Numbers 1 through 11, and we're still at Sinai. We're still there. So history kind of slows down when you hit Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers. When you get to Numbers, they're still at Sinai. It ends on the east side of the Jordan 40 years later. That's where it ends. It's interesting to me that if you do the math and you watch the trek from Sinai to the Promised Land is not a 40-year trip. It's an 11-day trip. Their 11-day trip took 40 years to make. I wonder why. You'll find out when you read the book of Numbers. So, and again, as Numbers begins, they're at Sinai. As Numbers ends, they've traveled up. They've actually taken some land on the east side of the Jordan, and as Numbers ends, they're on the east side of the Jordan, getting ready to go into the Promised Land. 40 years after the book begins. Some key stories in the book of Numbers that you probably have heard: Balaam and the talking donkey. That's a Numbers story. The bronze serpent that Jesus himself refers to in the New Testament. As the serpent was lifted up in the wilderness, so must the Son of Man be lifted up. The bronze serpent is a Numbers story. Korah's rebellion, which I'm not going to give anything away because we're going to get there next Sunday in Sunday school. Korah's rebellion is found in the book of Numbers. The 12 spies. 12 men went to spy on Jordan. 10 were bad, 2 were good. That is the story found in the book of Numbers. That is actually the bellwether moment for the people of Israel. That is the bellwether moment for this nation, this generation coming out of Egypt. It is the bellwether event. We will talk about that as we go. Themes for the book of Numbers really are God. I'd say there's really one theme for the book of Numbers, and it is God. In several ways. So God, his sovereignty is clear in the book of Numbers. God being in control of all things, and God being sovereign over all things and all peoples is clear in the book of Numbers. You see that in his working with his people. You see that as working with people that aren't his people, like Balaam and Balak, which you'll get in Numbers 26. You'll get there eventually. You'll read about that. The talking to God's sovereignty even over animals and letting an animal talk or having an animal talk. So his sovereignty is clearly there. His presence is there. In fact, God's presence is with his people to a point. And at one point, the people decide to try something on their own without his presence, and they fail miserably at that because his presence isn't with them. His presence is not with them at that point. So his presence with his people is a key thing. His uniqueness. What I mean by that is he is unlike any other God. He is unlike any other God. He's unlike any other thing that exalts itself as God. He is totally and completely unique. And I think as you read through the book of Numbers, you will see his uniqueness on display. You'll see his exclusiveness on display. You're to worship God and God alone, God and no other, God and nothing else. God is exclusive. You'll see that as you get through the book of Numbers, and you'll see his faithfulness on display. His faithfulness to himself, first of all, his faithfulness to his word, second of all, and his faithfulness to his covenant people, thirdly. Those are ways you'll see his faithfulness. Even when his desire was to destroy the people and start with Moses, even then he was faithful to his name, faithful to himself, and faithful to his covenant with Abraham, so that he didn't destroy the people, yet he worked with them and worked through them. One of the saddest moments in this generation's history, the generation that came out of Egypt, is found a year and about 3 months after they came out of Egypt. A year and 3 months after they came out of Egypt, we hit Numbers chapter 13. Numbers chapter 13, a year and 3 months out of Egypt. I'm stressing that because it's not like ancient history for them. It's a year and 3 months. They have seen God do amazing, miraculous things. They have seen God take them to the Red Sea, part the Red Sea. They walked through on dry ground. Then he closed that Red Sea and killed all Egypt's armies and spared them from those. They have seen him provide manna every morning. When they needed something to eat, God provided. They had seen him provide quail every evening. They had seen him provide fresh water when they needed something to drink. They had seen him over and over and over provide for them in a miraculous way. They'd watched that. And yet when they get to the land in Numbers 13, they go in and spy out the land. In Numbers 14, they're called to go in. And because the spies report, no, we can't do that, we're like grasshoppers to them. The nation as a whole, with the exception of 3 or 4 people, actually 4, Aaron, Moses, Joshua, and Caleb, the nation as a whole rejects God. Rejects God, seeks to stone Caleb and Joshua and Moses and Aaron, to appoint a new leader and to head back to Egypt. Rather than going, even though they'd seen that stuff within a year. Within a year, they'd seen that. They'd seen the faithfulness of God. That generation rejected God, and because of that, God rejects that generation. God rejects that generation. And that's why the 11-day trip took 40 years. Because the people in their complaint said, "What'd you bring us out here, Moses? Did you bring us out here to die in the wilderness? Is that what you brought us out here for? That's all you're good for. You got us here to die in the wilderness?" And to that I say, as I said to someone, be careful. You just might get what you ask for. Because God's going to give them exactly what they said. They're all going to die in the wilderness. If you were 20 years old and up in that generation, you didn't make the promised land. You'd die in the wilderness. Because they rejected God, God rejected them. And it was a serious rejection. Serious rejection. So that is probably for that generation, it is the bellwether incident for them. There'll be others. There'll be other rejections. There'll be other rebellions. In fact, 2 chapters after that one, there's another one. We'll talk about Sunday morning in Sunday school, the rebellion of Korah, where they again try to overthrow Moses, throw Moses off, appoint new leadership, and head back to Egypt. Because life was so good back there. Life was so good in Egypt. Remember the meat pots, the free fish that they had, they were looking for. Really, Numbers is really for me, it's a disheartening book when you look at Israel. But for me, it's also a display of the grace of God. A display of the grace of God, because I recognize that if it wasn't for God's work of grace in my life, I would be exactly the same way that those people are. But God's work of grace does something amazing in the heart of the believer and makes us able to respond to him correctly. It's really, really cool. But it's only because of grace. It's not because of anything inherently good in me. It's all because of his grace that accomplishes that through me. So that is the book of Numbers. Outline. Census number 1 is the first. And I forgot to put my chapter references here. So let me see if I can find them real quick. I'll just give them to you. Census number. I'll send them out. Census number 1 is first. Preparation number 1 is second. So there's a census of the people, and then they're prepared to go. There's travel. They travel from, and it's not wandering. This is not wandering. It's travel from Mount Sinai up to Kadesh Barnea. They traveled. Number 4 is rebellion. At Kadesh Barnea, they rebel. I know that's chapter 14 and 15. Chapter 13 and 14. There's wandering. They wander now. Because they refuse to go in, God says, okay, you're not going in. You're not going in. And in Numbers chapter 14, rather than the pillar of cloud and fire heading into the promised land where it should have gone, it heads south back into the wilderness. And they begin their 40-year trek of wandering around and around and around and around. They try to fix it themselves, though. In Numbers 14, they try to fix it themselves. They say, okay, sorry, God, we'll do it now. We'll go get them. So they try to go up against the Amalekites, and they're defeated soundly because God is not with them. And God did not tell them to go. It's another sad story. So there's wandering. And then number 5 is the census of the second generation. So census number 2. And number 6 or 7 is the preparation of the second generation. So preparation number 2. So that's the outline of Numbers. And I got like 5 minutes because I don't want to keep you too late to try to get through Deuteronomy. I'm going to take longer than 5 minutes. Just know it's going to be longer than 5 minutes. Michael won't mind, I'm sure. So Deuteronomy. When we get to Deuteronomy, Deuteronomy falls right on the heels of Numbers. Numbers, at the end of Numbers, they've come up the east side of the Jordan. They've actually defeated some of the kings over there. They've defeated kings and taken property. And so now they're perched on the east side of the Jordan, getting ready to head over into the promised land. I should have done the other way, I guess. Into the promised land. And as they wait, Moses now, this generation is now a new generation. Every one of the people that are still alive, with the exception of Joshua, Caleb, and Moses, because Aaron has died in the wilderness, with every one of those people was 20 years old or less at the time of the rebellion at Kadesh Barnea. So the oldest person, aside from Joshua and Caleb, is right at 60. Everybody else is younger than that. It's a pretty young generation that's been wandering the wilderness. They were not adults at the foot of Sinai. Most of them weren't even born at the foot of Sinai when God gave the law the first time. Most of them were not even born. So what Deuteronomy is the second law. That's actually what it means. Deuteronomy means second law. It's when God, through Moses, gives the law to the new generation of Israel, who's getting ready to go in and possess the land. That's what Deuteronomy is. That's what it's all about. It takes place 40 years after they've come out of Egypt. So the 40 years have passed. The old generation has died. The new generation is there. They're getting ready to go in and take the land. Really, Deuteronomy is a series of 4 messages that are preached by Moses. A series of 4 messages. And in fact, I can give you the outline real quick. First message, second message, third message, fourth message. That's it. Chapters 1 through 5, chapter 1 through 4, 6 through 26, 27 to 30, and 31 to 34. There's your outline. Okay, so that was quick. Actually, I did make it. What Moses does first, as he stands before the people of this new generation, the first thing he does in the first 4 chapters is he reviews their history for them. He reviews history from Exodus, from Egypt, all the way to where they find themselves now. And he walks through God's success and God's leading them all the way through to the point that he's got them where they're ready to go in. So that's what really is going on first. The second major message is the law. From chapter 5, verse 1 to all the way through chapter 26 is the law given the second time. And it is an extensive retelling of the law for the people. You'll find a lot of what you read in chapters 5 through 26 of Deuteronomy. You'll find a lot of that as information already listed in Exodus and Leviticus and Numbers. You'll see a lot of repeat stuff. But it's important because this new generation is getting it really for the first time. So that's what he does in the second. The third address is, what he's doing is he's getting ready. Moses is going to die. At the end of Deuteronomy, Moses is going to die, and Moses is not going to get to go in. You'll find out why he doesn't get to go in as you read through Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers. You'll find out why he didn't go in. I'm not going to give it to you. You probably might already know, but I'm not telling you why. But he doesn't get to go in either. But it's not because of Kadesh Barnea. It's not because he rebelled at Kadesh Barnea. It's another incident in his life. So he's not going to get to go in. He's going to die on the mountain. And so as he's getting ready to die, he's getting ready them to look at their future. And part of the future is this promise of blessing and promise of cursing. In Deuteronomy chapter 28, we have actually blessings and cursings. Where half the people went up on one mountain, half the people went on another mountain, and they shouted at each other these blessings and cursings. And God said to the people, if you do what I call you to, if you do what I call you to, I will bless you when you sit down, I'll bless you when you stand up, I'll bless you when you go in, I'll bless you when you come out, I'll bless your kids, I'll bless your livestock, I'll bless your land, I'll bless everything there is about you, if you do what I call you to. Then the wording is really interesting because he says, but when you don't, not if you don't, but when you don't, I will curse you this exact same way. I'll curse you the exact same way. And so really, Deuteronomy, the blessings and cursing actually sets up the reason we have the prophets and the minor prophets and all those things that happen later on in Israel, because they fail to fear him, they fail to love him, they fail to treasure his commandments, and they fail to do them. Because of that, God has to judge them because he's faithful to his name, and he's faithful to his word, and he's faithful to his people. But interestingly, God never throws them off. God never stops being their God. He never says, you will stop being my people. In fact, the promise is always restoring that people to a covenant relationship with him. And then the last major section is Moses actually passing the baton from himself to Joshua, who would become the leader. What are some key themes in the book of Moses? No, the book of Deuteronomy. The key theme, it's the nature and character of God revealed to this next generation. Revealed to the next generation. That's a key theme. Covenant relationship. Covenant relationship is an important theme based in the book of Deuteronomy, covenant relationship. And really one of the neatest things about the covenant relationship is God makes it really clear that it's not about Israel. It's not about their faithfulness or who they've been or how they've lived. It's not about Israel. It's about God. In fact, he's going to give them 5 instances in their history when he proves in Deuteronomy. Starts, I think, in chapter 7 and goes through chapter 9. He gives 5 instances in their history where they didn't deserve anything, and yet he still loved them, still put his affection on them, and still chose them to be his people, even with what they've done in the wilderness. Another key theme is sin and its consequences. Because of their sin, there are extreme consequences. One consequence for the people was because of their sin. The first generation sin, they didn't enter the wilderness. Consequence of Moses' sin, he didn't go. In the promised land. Consequence of Moses' sin, he didn't go in the promised land. And so that's that. Really, regarding stories in Deuteronomy, they're not a whole lot. Really, you're going to recognize. We don't tell a whole lot of Deuteronomy stories. Not a lot of Sunday school stories that come out of the book of Deuteronomy. We don't usually talk in Sunday school. If you kill your brother, you should be killed. That's not what we talk about in Sunday school. That's what you find in Deuteronomy. It really is a restatement of the law, and that's that. Yeah, it's 5. It's almost 10 till. So I need to bring it to a close. So I'll call it that. That's the book of Deuteronomy. I love this section of Scripture. I don't know if you can tell it or not. I love this section of Scripture. I am an Old Testament kind of guy, and please don't approach the Old Testament like it's just interesting stories for the New Testament. It's not. It's so much more. It really is the foundation. It's the foundation for all of our faith. And getting a good understanding of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy really lays the foundation for a good understanding of why we believe what we believe and why we hold truth so significantly. So please don't just view this as interesting stories or source material. It's a big deal. It's big. Like David said, these things were written for our instruction. These things were written for our instruction and for our own growth and benefit. So I'm going to call it good. I always feel like I cheated you in these things. What we need a checkpoint for every book, 40 minutes for every book, and still I'd have to have 3 or 4 for some books. I get that. It's just there's so much here, and I hate to cheapen any of it. I really hate to cheapen any of it or miss any of it because it all matters. So while I can't get it to you in a 45-minute talk, you can get it for yourself when you sit and read it every morning. So please don't neglect to read. Mike.
Is there a book that you've written, or someone that you like to read about? You said, I love the Old Testament, I love the Old Testament.
There are two books, Josephus, The Antiquities of the Jews. You probably wouldn't enjoy that one because it's a really hard book to read. I really love Josephus, Antiquities of the Jews. And there's a really good book I have. I don't think it's in print anymore. It's called A Survey of Israel's History. It's a really good book. I don't think you can get it anymore, though. I think it's out of print.
Survey of what?
A Survey of Israel's History. I think it's by Wood is the guy's name. It's the book we got when I was in Bible college 2,000 some years ago that we used to study through the Pentateuch. That's what we used. I think they're just practicing music. We got like 10 minutes until. Anybody else have questions? I guess I do have a few minutes for questions. John.
Numbers that do censuses, but later on, I think it's David gets in trouble for doing it.
Oh, good question. Yeah.
So I was wondering about.
The question was, in Numbers there are two censuses taken, but later on, David takes the census and is judged because of that. That's because when God directs the census, he's getting a group of the people, getting them organized. When David takes the census, it's actually after a prohibition for censuses to be taken. The prohibition for census doesn't happen until after Numbers, and is really in regard to a king taking a census of the people so that he would be confident in his ability and his strength of his people rather than being confident in the ability and strength of his God. That's the reason that there's the prohibition for the king to take a census. God never prohibits himself for taking a census. So, it's a good question. Very good question. Any others? Okay, I put you to sleep. I know I did. And I know I probably talked so fast and said so much you probably didn't catch any of it. And I'm sorry about that. Linda.
Would you just address that why we aren't going to follow the law besides the fact that Jesus came, that we're not Israel?
Exactly. Why do we? So the question is, I think, why do we or do we not follow the law?
Do we not?
Do we not? Okay. We don't follow the law. We're not Israel. Israel. The law was given. Now there are certain laws that are before Israel. Don't kill. That's pre-Israel. Those are before Israel kind of laws that existed before Israel existed. There was a certain codified law that was given to Israel. That's the Ten Commandments. That's the all those things that are there, plus the Levitical law. That was given to Israel, a specific people, a specific purpose for a specific time. And because we're not Jews, we're not Israel, we are not bound by that law. We're not bound by it. We're bound by something even more significant, which is called the law of Christ. And Christ explains the law a little bit when he says to his disciples and the people on the Mount, the Sermon on the Mount, you have heard it said, you shall not kill your brother, or don't commit whatever it is. It's not in my head. Thou shalt not murder. That's the one. But I say unto you, if you even hate your brother, you've committed murder already. You've heard it said, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you, if you even look at someone to lust after them, you've committed adultery already. You see, the law of Christ is much more, is more about the heart than it is about an outward appearance. See, the law was given to Israel with the intent to show them that when they would keep it, they would be, as Isaiah says, a city on a hill, that because they love the Lord their God with all their heart, soul, strength, and mind, because they love their neighbor as theirself, all these nations who were worshiping false gods would look and say, hey, not working for us, it's working for them, we should be following that God. What Israel did was they said, it's us four and no more, you're not a part of this. They excluded everybody else, and so they did do what they were supposed to do, and they failed miserably. So the law, and I need like an hour to answer that question. But it is really a valid, good question. Do we keep the Sabbath? Absolutely, we don't keep the Sabbath. We don't keep the Sabbath. The Sabbath is not for us. What about the Christian Sabbath? There is no such thing. There is no such thing. Is there a such thing as Lord's Day? Absolutely, there's such thing as a Lord's Day. And do we worship on Sunday for a reason? Absolutely, we worship on Sunday for a reason. I'm not going to tell you what that is. We'll get there in the book of Acts. You'll figure it out. That's like way at the end of the year. You'll get there. But I'm not going to tell you what it is. But there are the law itself does not apply to us, and this is really important. Really important because if Jesus, if it would have been the law and a keeping of the law, and Jesus came to keep the Jewish law, then we would not be included. Gentiles would not be included because the law was never intended to purify Gentiles. It was only intended to purify Jews and those that proselyted themselves and became Jewish. I don't think anybody here's done that. Anybody here's done that. We would not be included. But Jesus is not a priest after the order of Aaron. He's a priest from the order of Melchizedek. And Melchizedek was a priest that worshiped the Most High God of all peoples. So when Jesus offered himself as a sacrifice, he sacrificed for all peoples, not just the Jews. It's so important. In fact, Jesus couldn't have been a Jewish priest. Jesus couldn't have been a Jewish priest because he's not from Levi. He's not from Levi. John?
If we have time, follow up to that question. So
Okay.
Galatians says the law has become our tutor to lead us to Christ. So I take that as you see God's holiness, we see that we fall short.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Paul makes it really clear in Galatians that it is impossible to keep the law. Can't be done. And what the law was intended to do was to show us our need for a lawkeeper, a perfect lawkeeper that's not us. And that was Jesus himself. That was Jesus himself. Yeah, man, I'd like to keep going on that one, but I wish I could. I mean, I have some really beautiful pictures, not that I've painted, but I can walk through that, but I don't have time. I would take away from Michael's time tonight, so it's a good question. Good questions. I better let you go. So thank you for coming. Good turnout. I really appreciate you being here.
Thank you.
Come back next time.